Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larson. On this episode, we get to have Noah Berkson. We're going to hear about his big exits as an entrepreneur, working with funds, the family office, the Weekend of Man, his new podcast, a lot of fun things. Noah, thanks for doing this. And how do you introduce yourself when people ask what you do?
Thank you so much for having me, Jess. It's funny because that's always like the scariest question when you have a lot of things that you're doing and there's not a super cohesive answer. But just from a high level, I run a family office platform day to day. We're called Austin Capital. We're a kind of vertically integrated fintech financial service platform spun out of a family office, a single family office. So we own a bunch of assets in the space, one being a trust bank in Nevada. We have a modern core banking business, so banks and FIs run on our core. We have a payments issuer processor. We have a high-risk payments business. We have a few RIAs, an asset management platform, a professional services business, virtually anything that touches fintech financial services. And we invest, we incubate, we buy, and we're really excited about that. Outside of it, run a farmland marketplace. Think of us kind of like Zillow for farmland, called Common Ground, that we incubated out of our fund in 2020.
Very cool. Let's do a little bit of backstory. Tell us a couple of the big career highlights pre-family office work here.
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest, grew up in Iowa. I was a terrible student, just awful. Had really bad ADHD, but I think I got my first kind of opportunity doing door-to-door sales, and kind of learned entrepreneurship in some regard from that. Started out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, selling home security systems door to door. So you just get rejected all day for a living. You start to really embrace rejection and start to really like it. And it's like a game. How do I overcome this? Took that, ended up going to college, the University of Iowa. Ended up starting a company then. Originally, the idea was to create something. It was called Grid. The idea was kind of like a LinkedIn. Right when LinkedIn was up and coming, but still in the pretty early days, and that ended up turning into a software development business. Brought that to Chicago. Ended up exiting out of that. Was kind of looking for the next thing. Joined a couple guys building a health tech business. So we built a SaaS platform for hospitals and health systems to assist with this pharmaceutical drug discount program called 340B. Funny enough, it's like my longest standing investment, and got some really good news this past Monday about that business. So really excited about that. Then went and did a joint venture, built a property analytics company. So we use drones to survey pavements and roofs of large industrial property owners, retailers, REITs. Think of like Walmart and Blackstone and Prologises of the world. We would do these property surveys, help them understand how to do capital and maintenance expenditures. So very kind of boring business, but bringing a tech approach that made a whole lot of sense. When I got out of that, I ended up starting a staffing business, kind of by mistake. I was doing a bunch of angel investing, realized that a lot of the companies I was investing in were saying, "Hey, Noah, can you help us build some offshore engineering teams? I know that you've done that in the past. We want to keep our burn down." And so I was helping with that. And at the point I said, "Well, wait, I should be making some money doing this. Like I'm doing a lot of work for free," and ended up starting a staffing business with a friend of mine. We were lucky enough to scale that. We hit really good timing as well. And think like that, like 2019, 2021 period. We ended up selling that at the end of 2021. Alongside it, we'd spun up a venture fund that was called Candor Ventures. Kind of the insight there was, hey, we're staffing a bunch of these companies that are really early stage, and we have a pretty unique insight into what's happening in them because, as most investors sit, they have whatever information the company's telling you, right? So it's like everything's going great. We're on the upswing. Prospective customers love this, and we're in there because we have all these engineers, and they're like, well, the sales demos aren't working, or like the product isn't working, or they're having these issues. So we're like, we kind of have a unique insight here. Why don't we spin up a fund and just start investing into some of these companies? And so we started something called Candor Ventures, ended up creating a studio arm of that as well, with the idea to incubate businesses, one of which was that farmland marketplace that I mentioned called Common Ground.
Yeah. Um, so you've told me some pretty impressive numbers before. Are you sharing any of the size of any of these exits publicly?
Nothing is public right now. But we're really happy about it. I think also we rolled part of the deal of our studio and then also of our staffing business into a kind of a holdco platform, which when you do that, you're definitely taking a gamble. I think that will pay off really tremendously for us. So I'm really excited about that. But it also is time, and it's also putting your time and attention into something for a long period.
Yeah. Are we allowed to at least say how many figures without saying the number? Or do you want to hold off?
Eight, yeah, eight figures.
Yeah. Um, so when you think about a business with that many zeros, um, what did you not expect from all the books and all the YouTube and all the everything everybody tells you? What did you not expect until you actually did it yourself?
I think what you don't expect is, it's funny. You start out with this idea of building a business. In this case, we really didn't anticipate selling it, but generally you think, oh, one day I could sell this business. But you don't do any of the things that you would need to do to sell that business. So when you get to that point and you start in diligence and whatnot, you go, then they're just dumping like, hey, here's a list of 120 things that we need you to give us. And you start looking and go, well, oh man, we haven't like we signed a contract one time with that client 3 years ago. We never updated our contract. Oh, well, that's not really. They're like, well, is that a valid contract? Like, we don't know. You just don't set anything up to actually exit out at the end. And so everything is such a mess in the business, and it takes so much time to be able to get all of that together. I think what I see in a lot of other friends and entrepreneurs who have sold their business is because of this, they get into this. I mean, selling a company is generally is a lot of work and takes a long time anyway, always longer than you think it will. But there's a lot of deal fatigue. And you kind of get to you get to a point in that deal where you go, I just want to get this deal done. And I think now understanding from the private equity side, how you think about that as a private equity firm or investor, that's all kind of part of the playbook. So it's like we know that there's going to be deal fatigue in this, and we almost want there to be because at the end, when we come back and we say, "Hey, I know we agreed on this number, but like we're gonna only be able to get it done at somewhere below that," and someone's just gonna say, "Yeah, I just I'm mentally now invested in getting the deal done." And I've already in my mind like that deal is done. So now like let's just get it done. And so I think the deal fatigue and just being ready was something that I really didn't expect.
Yeah, when I was in M&A at Citi 20 years ago, we were doing sell side transaction fees. And it's like literally what we had to teach CEOs. I'd be talking to somebody, he'd owned the business for 30 years and had to talk about like, hey, so let's think about this as like, you've never actually played basketball before, the game of selling companies. And, we're going to send this out to 1,500 private equity groups in a wash description, trying to get 100 NDAs signed of people that say the real thing, get down to six people, six different firms. We want to get a bidding war for you. But here's the thing, you know, these guys buy many companies per year. You've never sold a company in history. And you start telling them these tricks, right? It was like, honestly, it's like the car salesman where, um, they have to keep going back and talking to the mysterious finance guy that you never get to meet, and it takes forever, and they're giving you tons of drinks so that you need to use the restroom and 3.5 hours later, you're signing something you wouldn't have signed 2.5 hours earlier, right? Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, during the process too, because generally when the process sets out, because it's going to take a period of time to get the deal done, they'll say, okay, great. And I see this a lot of times in startup or venture companies too. They're like, well, where are you going to be? Let's say, like, what are your projections for this year? And, you start this negotiation in February and you're like, oh, we're going to do 10 million of revenue this year when we did 2 last year. Right. And they go, okay, wow, like, yeah, incredible. But by the time that deal is getting done, it is the end of that year. And they're like, well, you said you're going to be at 10 million in revenue. Like, you're at 3 million right now. Like, we're going to have to go back and redo these terms. So I think also just understanding that, like, all of those things, they're going to come back to that. And that is the basis that they're looking at for the business. And so I think also being very realistic about where you're going with the business.
yeah. So I know we're not disclosing numbers, but can you tell people Which one of the businesses grew the biggest that you were running?
Our staffing business for sure.
Okay.
I think having so we did nearshore staffing. I guess a little bit was outside of that in Asia, but predominantly South America and Latin America. I think you saw too that during a kind of ZERP era, you'd have clients coming and they'd say, "Oh, we need 60 engineers, or we need 40 more engineers," and you're like, "Wow, we're staffing these people, right? It's labor arbitrage." Um, they're really good cash businesses, and they can be tremendous cash businesses. I would say now, as I look at it, the industry is becoming a lot more challenging. Um, if people are seeing that there's an opportunity to enter, like the barrier is fairly low, and so you've seen a number of companies start to enter the space. I think what I'm seeing today is companies that are trying to kind of be the niche, and so say, okay, instead of like general product, we're only doing market engineers that work on marketing, or we're only doing engineers that we only staff engineers to fintech companies. And so you're seeing people start to specialize a lot instead of be very general. And I'd expect that that's where the industry will go, at least for the next 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah. Well, a topic we bring up a lot on the show that's always interesting to both CEOs and fund managers is fundraising. So thinking about both fundraising as an entrepreneur, fundraising as a fund manager where you've got to get your LPs, and then also being the investor as you've had these other roles. Do you want to let's start with what you see as a couple of rookie mistakes out there when people are trying to start raising, in the many millions.
I think if you're looking at entrepreneurs that are raising, I think a lot of times there's very arbitrary numbers that get put out. And so they say, hey, I need to go raise this much money, without really realizing, like, is that amount of money going to get you to where you can raise more money? Because we see, especially right now, a lot of companies get stuck where they say, hey, I'm going to raise $3 million for my pre-seed or seed round. And that $3 million lasts a year, but a year, like, you haven't actually made that much progress as a business. Maybe you've built your first product, got a couple of customers, but that story is not compelling enough to go raise more money at a higher valuation. I see a lot of companies getting stuck right there. I also see a lot of companies that are just raising way more money, or money that they actually don't need to raise. There's a lot of situations now where I'll talk to companies and they're like, oh, we're at 300,000 of ARR or 500,000. And now we need to go fundraise, where they haven't taken any capital yet. And I'm like, why are you doing that? And they're like, well, just what you do, right? Like we want to build a team. We want to go, we want to grow. And I'm like, I don't think, like, even though I'm invested, like, that's great. Like, I'd love to invest in that company. From the other side, I'm like, I would not want to take investor capital at this point. Like, your life is going to be so much easier, because there's a lot of those businesses that they can sell, it can be a phenomenal business, but they might sell that company for $30 million, $50 million, $100 million and own all of it. But the second you take on that investor money, like, you have to have a huge outcome, and everything is driven towards that. And, I even just with my own experience with our farmland marketplace, we raised venture capital. We originally didn't plan on it. We said, hey, we're just going to bootstrap this, and this is great. And then, in 2020, we started just getting emails from people that were using it, like, hey, are you raising money? Hey, are you raising money? And for a while, we're like, it's like, that's nice. It's flattering. It means we're probably on the right track with things. But eventually it was like, no, like, we want to invest. And then you go, well, if it's going to be this easy to raise money, well, we may as well raise money. But then in retrospect, I think you make a lot of decisions when you have money very differently than you would when you didn't have it. And so, a good example of this in that business was, we said, hey, we see Zillow makes a lot of their money from these broker tools, or like their housing professional tools. And we said, well, the agriculture marketplace is very similar. So why don't we build some tools for land professionals? And right away, it was like we started building, and all these people were excited about it. They were like, yes, we can't wait to use it. And then we'd give it to them. They'd be like, oh, I'd love to use it, but it doesn't have this one feature yet, right? And then we go, well, we just need to build that next feature, right? We have the money to do it. Let's just build that, and then we're gonna, and then it'll work. And you go down that path, and after a while, we're like, wait, this is not working. People do not actually want this in the way that we think they do. Whereas if that was your own money, that would be so quick that you would say, oh, that's not working. Okay, let's just pivot away from that entirely, compared to like, let's just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. That's a hard lesson to learn.
Yeah. Why do you think that bootstrapping is so underrated?
Why do I think it's underrated? I think people really just don't understand the game as they get into it, right? Like many people, they're good at one thing, so they start a company and they don't really think about all the other levers in a company or really understanding where that company can go. There's just this idea that like, oh, this can be the biggest thing ever, right? Like, hey, our addressable market is huge, so we're going to capture that. Or like, even if we get 1% of this market, we can be a huge company. But a lot of people don't really understand that, like, you will never have 1% of that market and how tremendously hard it is to have 1% of that market. And that also you have optionality when you bootstrap because yes, like it is more challenging from the beginning. It does force you typically to get profitable very quickly. Where I see a lot of I think there's this move right now into people are realizing with like Palantir being a great example, services can be really lucrative businesses. Services kind of as software. And so I think a lot of people when they bootstrap, they say, okay, well, we kind of need to start with some type of services because we can get customers right away. They can pay us and that can support the business. But they think that in the long term, that's going to kind of derail the value of the business. And I think we're finding that it's quite the opposite today. If you can be sticky, but also then it allows you to go take, if you do, and I think burnout is another piece of this that people just don't think a whole lot about. But when you go do something every day and it is a grind for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, the probably 12 years is the maybe more now, the average of the company is going, like you may get to a point and you say, I don't want to do this anymore. Like I'd love to sell the company. But if you bootstrap, your options to do that are great, right? Like generally, if you have a good business, you can find a buyer and someone's excited. But when you're venture backed, then like your investors are like, are you joking? We signed up for this to be, this is either it's a one or a zero, right? It's a $1 billion business or it's nothing. And so they're like, absolutely not. Like get back and keep going. And I think that's the scariest thing where you have founders that are just entirely unmotivated anymore and completely burnt out, but kind of forced to drive towards an outcome that, candidly probably won't happen. And the investors, at the end of the day, they say, well, it's fine if it's a zero, but you're going to spend your entire life, right? Like trying to build that company, put everything you have into it, and it may ultimately be a zero.
Yeah. I think about a couple of bootstrapping stories out by me, Pluralsight bootstrapped for, I don't know, like 10 years and then took some money, got into the billions, Qualtrics, same thing. I think bootstrapped for like 9 years or 12 years or something. And then, in the tens of billions, right? And I've been at conferences or, I've met, both Aaron Sconard and Ryan Smith, and they talk about things of like the discipline of bootstrapping. Like when you come with that mindset and you figure out your product market fit, then you pour gas on the fire, why they feel like that model can be so superior sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's so many great examples of people who have bootstrap, but also people see the now, right? Like, wow, that company is so successful. They don't realize like they've spent the last 12 years of their life, every day on this business to get it where it is. Backbase was another really good example in the financial services space that was like a $2.5 billion business today that was bootstrapped. But yeah, I think it's tremendously underrated. I do think though that with kind of the growing proliferation of AI, you're going to see a lot more companies that have the ability to bootstrap and say, well, I don't really need to spend 500,000 or $1 million to build this product. Like I can get 80% of the way there with I don't know, a couple $1,000 building something, and we can get some revenue and then keep driving. So I hope to see that.
Yeah. What's one thing that you feel like you did do right fundraising?
I think being able to tell a story and being able to be realistic. I think that I want to be able to set expectations when we're fundraising. I think the natural inclination is to go say, hey, this is going to be the biggest business ever. This is going to be the next, Uber, Airbnb, etc. And I think being able to be realistic and say, hey, like here's all the challenges in this business. here's all the headwinds that we're going against. If we're not successful, here's why we won't be successful. But just to set expectations from the start, because I think otherwise you have a lot of investors that are like, you said it was going to be this, and that's not where you are. And I think along the way, you want your investors on your team, right? I think that's really important. And some people look at investors and they go, oh, I just get a check from them. And that's really like, it's very transactional. Like, let me get a check and keep moving. But it's like, those will be the most important people a lot of times, especially through hard times. Uh, I have some friends that have a business and they had a big issue in it where they lost a bunch of money. Not their fault. Had something happen and lost a ton of capital. And one of their investors just stepped in within hours and said, hey, I'm wiring this over to you. Like, eight-figure check. I'm wiring this over right now. We'll figure this out later, but I want to make sure that you guys are okay. And it's like, when you go tell that investor, oh, it's going to be this, and then it's not, like, you don't get that type of goodwill.
Yeah. When you think about starting relationships, let's say family offices, ultra high net worth individuals, maybe more so than a fund. When you think about a less transactional, the beginning of like a true relationship, what's a principle? What's something that you feel like is effective?
I feel like for me, it's always about adding value. I want to add value right away. I think that I want to take as long as possible. Like, I think you think about relationships. It's kind of like long-term investing. It's like this stuff just compounds, and I want to have like my relationship bank account, and I want to be the person that's like, I can provide you so much value, and I'm not going to ask for anything, because that I think then it's just like you start these transactional relationships, and even if that works right away, in the long term, I feel like those aren't the relationships that I want to have. And so I say, like, how do I give you some type of value right now? And with ultra high net worth people, really successful people, family offices, many times that's challenging for people because they go, well, they're the ones that they have all the money, they've been successful, all these things. Like, how am I valuable to that person? I found generally it's through relationships. I spend so much time cultivating relationships across industry. So not just one industry. Like, I'm in, my day to day is financial services. If I only knew financial services people, like, that wouldn't be very helpful for me in that. But typically it's like, oh, someone has a random, like, what are you working on? Oh, we have this random project. We have this, nonprofit where we're funding like bees, right? Oh my God, actually, I know the perfect person you've got to talk to. Like, they're really interested in this cause. That could be a great connection. Or like, how do you just find, how do you have enough people kind of around you that you're able to connect? And I think that's the easiest way to add value right off the bat. And I also think it's the way for people that might say, well, from a business standpoint, you haven't been as successful as me, right? So it's like, I'm not, I don't look at you as I don't look at you, let's say, as like a peer right on my level. But then I introduce somebody else that's right on their level and they go, wow, like the second I send an intro, that person responds and they're like, oh, who is Noah? Like, clearly he knows the right people.
Yeah. I like that on your X, your Twitter, it says Chief Networking Officer. So
I think that's but sorry to cut you off. I think that's a big opportunity, by the way. Just to, if you let me rant on this for a second. So I think that there's a lot of the most successful people that I know, at a point they become more insular. So they go from kind of being like, we need to meet everyone, we need to network, and then they get successful and they're like, oh, I don't really need to do that. I kind of keep my circle close, and I don't make many new friends. Like, people I actually like, I get on calls sometimes, but it's not like people I actually hang out with. And I think there's a big opportunity to kind of be like this chief networking officer for people. You say, you're going to pay me, but it's a service, right? But I'm going to introduce you to a bunch of other stellar people that you would really get along with, and you'll probably like be friends. You'll be lifelong friends with. And so whether that's like, hey, I'm traveling here. Oh, great. Let me introduce you to this person. You guys got to get together. I think there's a lot of that, because I think the older you get, like, you stop doing all the things. A friend of mine, we go visit in Vermont every year. He's like in his mid 70s. His name's Kevin. And he goes out like mountain bikes with us, most active mid 70-year-old you've ever seen. But, we were asking like, what's a piece of advice that you have? And he said, always have younger friends. I was like, why? He's like, well, because as you get older, people just stop doing things, right? All of your friends, like, they're kind of busy with their family. They're busy with what they're doing. They stop going on the adventures. They stop taking the spontaneous trips. They stop doing the endurance events. And he's like, but I want to do that. So I figured out my conduit to that is just to always make younger friends. And I really resonated with that.
That's awesome. Um, okay, speaking of friends and networking, I think we got to give a shout out to our mutual friend AJ who got us together. To me, he's an example. Like he's already introduced me to multiple interesting people. I know you guys hang out a lot together. What do you like about AJ?
I think AJ is one of the most just dynamic people. His ability to kind of like span industry, right? Where he's respected not only in the industry that he works in, right, which was sports and is now in the AI interior design space, but people that you'd meet anywhere respect AJ and they go, "Oh, AJ," like they see him very highly, right? And I think that's also because he's a great connector, and so he keeps he goes out of his way to meet people, regardless, like with no intent, right? So he's meeting people, like he will go to events that have nothing to do with what he's doing, just because he's like, I'm gonna go meet people. It was so funny actually. A friend of mine said they met AJ, and I go, where'd you meet him? Because I was like, oh, interesting. Like where'd you meet him? I just couldn't think of where they crossed paths. And she goes, oh, it was a women founders event. I go, you met AJ at a women's founders event? And she's like, yeah, he was like there were two guys there, and he was one of them, and there's like 200 women. Like, I love this. Like, this is what I love about AJ is like he makes his way and he goes to those things, and he seems to just like in a crowd he finds the right people, and he builds relationships and he adds value and he follows up.
Yeah. That follow up is so key, isn't it?
The follow up is so key, and it's absolutely the hardest thing. But I think like for instance, for me, I've gotten better at it. I'm definitely not the best at it. But I keep I built out like a pretty sophisticated system to be able to follow up with people and make sure that I'm keeping on top, because it's really easy. I think my kind of thought on any relationship that's new is either you build momentum the second that you meet someone. So like you and I hop on a call and we have a good conversation, and then I can either say like, yeah, like, all right, cool. Let's chat sometime, keep in touch. And like that relationship is probably never going to be close because I think you just have that moment of momentum. So it's like, okay, today, who can I introduce you to that's going to add some value to your life right now? Oh, let's make some future plans. Hey, you have something going on. You're in Park City. I'm going to be in Park City these dates. Like, let's see if we can get together. And so I think it's so much about just building momentum right away in a relationship. Otherwise, that's kind of the difference between having something that's like, this is going to be a very close friend, or this will be kind of an acquaintance and maybe we'll cross paths in the future. But what was the point of us talking if, there's nothing, if there's nothing there?
Yeah, no kidding. Are you 31, 32? How old are you?
31.
When you think about how like the level of going from door to door sales and working at, I think, in the restaurant industry before that, to millions and millions of dollars at your age, there's so many entrepreneurs that want to do that, and there's so few that accomplish that, especially in that time period. What do you think is different about you? What do you think you've done that others haven't done?
I got a really early start. So you think about you think about college. Like I spent most of that time kind of I don't know if acting like an adult. I was super immature, but kind of living the life of an adult. So one, I got a really good head start. Two, I think just understanding the value, again, like back to this, but understanding the value of relationships. And I think from a really early age, when so I went to Chicago with my first business. I met a guy who became kind of like a mentor to me. He owned a bunch of restaurants and nightclubs in Chicago, which is the most random of things for the person that is like a mentor to you. But he just really taught me the power of relationships, and it was clear like he owned these things. Yes, there was money involved with it, but he realized the network that he built from it. And it was just an interesting way. Like you wouldn't really think of that. Like, oh, you own a restaurant because you own a restaurant. You own a nightclub because you own a nightclub. He's like, oh, but if you see all the people that want to get in here every night, like I become very close with those people. Those people become my good friends. I have a lot of power in this dynamic, even though those people may be much more powerful and successful and, wealthier than I am, but they really want to get a table on that Friday night, or they really want to get into that nightclub, right? And so it was interesting to observe that at a pretty young age because, when I grew up, like in Iowa, I didn't know what a mentor was, right? Like, didn't grow up around wealthy people, didn't have any kind of inkling into that world. But I think one, going through a lot of rejection and learning to embrace it, that was a big, big learning for me. We went to our team for this door-to-door security sales. We became the top team in the country in Iowa. They would track this week over week and like how many security systems you're selling. And so as a reward, we got to go to South Central Los Angeles for a summer. And because basically the way that you may know this, but the way that the home security industry works is virtually they put people in these 5-year contracts. And they track this. So like if a certain neighborhood, if they have 5-year contracts, all of those probably expire right around the same time because they all get sold right at the same time. And so they knew that these areas in South Central Los Angeles were about to expire. And it's like an area that actually, has tons of crime. There's a reason you have a home security system living there, but we got to go there. And that was kind of like our present because it was, hey, you guys are the top performing team. We want to send you there because you're going to close so many deals. Like you can make so much money doing this. And so, yeah, it's just funny, like reminiscing on this. We were maybe, I don't know if it was 9 or 10 guys living in this like 2 or 3 bedroom apartment. If I remember, like you're just sleeping on the floor. You get up, you fit everyone into a tiny car and they just drop you off in a neighborhood. They say, don't take your cell phone. Don't take a wallet, maybe take like a few dollars to like grab lunch, at a gas station or whatever. We'll meet you back here at 9 p.m. And this could be like 8 a.m. And you're just out, you're very out of place. Like you feel like a little bit on edge the whole time, but you get to this point where like, wow, like I can really embrace this and you're just loving it. And you're loving like being able to look at somebody's house from the outside and say, I know every reason you're going to tell me why you don't want to buy this. And it's going to start with you telling me get off my property. And it's going to end with you shaking my hand, thanking me so much, and maybe introducing me to your kids who are there. And so I think just learning to embrace rejection was a really big thing for me as well.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, that you talk about this networking and getting people together. I know you got conferences coming up. Why don't you talk about your podcast and your cool co-host?
Yeah. Just started a podcast. I will release it hopefully sometime in December. Maybe it'll be early January. I think I've learned very quickly in starting a podcast. You think it's very easy, as I'm sure maybe when you started that you did, and then you realize, wow, there's a lot that goes into this. Like, oh my God. But started with a friend of mine, another entrepreneur. Her name's Jess Ma, who you're going to speak with, I think, at the beginning of the year here. But, we came together and we were talking about a platform. We said, hey, like, there's a lot of podcasts out there that we like, but a lot of it, like, there's not a whole lot of vulnerability. A lot of what you're seeing is like, it's how I built this, which is fantastic. It's like kind of the story of how you started the business. It's the, hey, I'm really wealthy now. But it's not the like, I don't know, what's really hard in your life? What's super challenging? Like, hey, you've made all this money, but are you actually happy? Because time and time again, I think you realize that the people that have done that, like, they're just as unhappy as everybody else, maybe more unhappy. And so we wanted to create a framework around that to be able to interview really interesting people, but just understand like what are they going through? What is their life like? And the way that we preface it to guests is if somebody wanted to get to know you, like on a very personal level, you would send them our podcast as a way to do that. And so we want that. We're really hoping that that can turn into something. It's been a lot of fun doing it, and I just realized like I get so much energy from it. You're like you have the best job in the world with this, being able to you just interview a bunch of really interesting people and get a chat with them, and that's. I don't know what more you can ask for. I think it's one thing I will say that I think is funny, and I had a podcast before that was in the venture capital space, but when I was getting into venture, I was like, I'd come from the entrepreneurial world, and I said I need to meet investors, but most investors don't really care to meet you. It's not like the top priority of somebody when you're like, hey, I'm just like getting into the space and investing. They're like, great. Like, are you raising money for a company? No. Like, I'm really busy. Are you going to invest in our fund? No. Okay, great. I'm really busy. And I was like, oh, like interesting. That's kind of challenging. And so I said, well, actually, I have an idea. And one day I went and I just wrote this. I wrote like a cold email that I was going to send on LinkedIn. And this was just an idea. And I said, hey, uh, I'm starting like name. I'm starting a podcast around the venture capital space called Venture Candor. We're planning our first 12 episodes. We think you'd be a great guest for the podcast. And I sent maybe 60 of these out. 59 people in a day or less responded and said, I'd love to. I was like, oh, no. How many views does this have? Where is it distributed? Like all these things. None of that. Just like, yes. And you're like, oh, that's kind of an interesting thing. Like people, I could reach out to these people and say, hey, I'd love to grab a coffee. And they may say, yeah, like either they don't respond. Or they say, yeah, let's look at Q4. Like how's, Q4 look? But when you're like, hey, we're doing a podcast, you're like, oh, I'd love to do that. Like how's next week? And so I think just learning that and understanding that was really interesting and informative. So we're looking forward to getting that launched.
Yeah. What's the title?
Dose of Greatness.
Dose of Greatness. Okay.
Dose of Greatness.
And tell us about your co-host.
Jess she's been a kind of lifelong entrepreneur. I think started in high school, and built a website hosting business in high school that was making six figures. Ended up co-founding a company called Indinero, which is a SMB software accounting company. Took a path with a business that was kind of venture backed and just turned it into a cash flow business that you don't see very often, but was able to parlay that into a lot of other businesses. Runs a family office now called Mawe, and so they do a lot of incubating and investing and in companies. And then has something called Astonishing Labs as well, funding some breakthrough biotech research. And so has kind of parlayed a normal business right into a large portfolio and ultimately a family office investing platform.
Yeah. So long-term listeners of the show will know one of my mini series called Longevity for Investors with Dr. Greg Bailey, the biotech investor. And he had brought her up to me first. Says like, hey, check out this super successful female entrepreneur. She pilots her own jet, flies around, does all this stuff. And she's back, she's been supporting one of the companies he's invested in, Mike Levin out there with Morphoceuticals, which is like basically science fiction come to life. And so it was fun to hear about her from you as well, and then get back together. And I'm excited to have her on the show. When you think about the power of a podcast and what you're looking at in February with your event coming up, what was your interest in going from digital to adding the in-person side with events?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the podcast is a really good way it's a good way to meet interesting people, right? That's what we're doing, right? We kind of optimize for like, hey, we just want to meet really interesting people and be able to tell their story to the world. I think we look at the podcast. We're not really looking at it as a business. In the sense that like it's not something that drives revenue or a money maker. It'll probably be a money loser, candidly. Fingers crossed it's not, but we'll see. And we're kind of prepared for that. But I think what we realize is that the power of getting to bring people together and introduce people. Like another thing with networking, it's like I think your network. A lot of people look at networking differently, and they go, "Oh my God, my network! That's such a good network. I have, I don't know, 2,000 people on LinkedIn I'm connected to." The way that I would look at it is say your network is really valued not by the number of people in it, but the number of people that know each other because of you that wouldn't have met each other, right? And so I think we look at it that way as, hey, we meet a lot of really interesting people, but where is our ability to bring all of those people into one space and to really get to know each other? Where people that are completely different industries, not there necessarily for the purpose of how do I go get this person to invest in my company or do a deal, but like, how do I meet a lot of other people like me? And I think that is kind of a lost, like it's like a lost art a little bit where everything that like conference wise, it's very transactional. It's, oh, you get sold, like go because you can sell people your product, you can get investors. Everything is very agenda driven. Where I think when you can make the agenda for everyone and be like, hey, um, we want you to come, and all you're going to do is get to meet really interesting people from different industries. It'll open your worldview up a little bit. You'll get different experiences. We'll have fun together. It'll be bonding because from the conference perspective, what we saw is that what we see in the market today is there's a lot of conferences that are really, they're business conferences, great people, people that maybe you'd say, hey, I would do business with these type of people or like be friends, but the content is really, it's just stale, right? It's like you sit there, it's a bunch of speakers, you're not really that invested in it. Or on the other side of it, there's things that are very fun. And you'd look at that as like, I don't know, Summit Series could be an example. There's a couple others, kind of Burning Man-esque, where you go, those are really fun, but the people, like, a lot of times a little bit woo-woo for me, in comparison, where it's like, I'm not necessarily like, I don't know that a lot of these relationships will kind of evolve out of this time together. And so I said, how do you kind of merge that? And you have something where you have really incredible people, but you're also able to have fun together, because I think the bonding comes from doing things that are fun, not from sitting there and listening to a speaker and regurgitating that together afterwards, but being able to, I don't know, go snowboard together, being able to just do things that are out of the ordinary. I think that's where a lot of the bonding comes from.
Yeah. It's certainly been that way for our Innovation Leadership Live series. And anyways, I'm super excited to see what your Park City one ends up looking like. And it'll be fun to have you up here for our Park City one here doing Sundance. So
Very, very much looking forward to that.
yeah. Well, if people want to follow you online or check out the companies, what are the best places?
I would just be at Noah Berkson on LinkedIn, Berkson. Same thing on Instagram. I would say I'm not active on Instagram, but you can still follow me there. But looking forward to connecting with people. I think my goal is to be a magnet to interesting people, and it's kind of agendaless, but just I want to meet people, and if I can add value, I'd love to do that.
Yeah. Maybe to close, what's one of the best pieces of advice you ever received?
I would say it's be long term greedy. I think that somebody said that to me, and when you're younger, that's really hard. I think as I joined some of these business groups really young, and you'd be around people that are in their, I don't know, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s when you're like in your 20s, and you go, well, you have all these things, like why don't I have that? Like we're here, quote unquote, we're like peers, but like you've been way more successful. You have all these things. You've done much better financially than I have. Why don't I have that? And I think that can make you make very short term decisions that aren't going to be very optimal for the long term. And it's like, how do I make this as quickly as possible? And generally, whenever you're like, how do I make money as quickly as possible, that doesn't go well. But really looking at things in a much longer time horizon. So be long term greedy.
I love it. Thanks for doing this, and thanks everybody for listening.